All right. Welcome, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be diving into something that's really, really critical for anyone who's looking to do business in Nigeria, and that is the art of tact.
Yeah, it's something that we've been really focusing on the show recently and, just really looking at what it takes to actually have things work in Nigeria. And one of the elements that consistently comes up again and again is tact.
Yeah, and to really unpack this, we're going to explore 6 interconnected areas. We're going to be talking about the power of words.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about the importance of timing,
Mm-hmm.
the art of listening, navigating cultural nuances, the role of patience, and finally, developing emotional intelligence. And like I said, these are all interconnected, and hopefully this will be a good guide for you.
Yeah, definitely. And so really just understanding these 6 different elements will give you just a very good grasp of what it takes to, actually engage with people in Nigeria in a successful way.
Yeah, one of the sources that we were looking at used a really striking image, and it was basically being tactful with your words is like a master key. It opens doors that brute force cannot.
Yeah, it's a very powerful analogy. And another source, mentioned, it said that not being tactful in business is like stepping on a landmine. The consequences can be explosive and far-reaching.
Yeah, and so we really want to make sure that you guys don't step on those landmines. We're going to try to give you the tools to navigate through this minefield.
For sure.
And so our goal today is basically just to give you the practical insights and the kind of awareness to really, enhance your own tact in your business dealings in Nigeria.
Yeah.
So let's just start off by talking about the power of words.
Okay, so the power of words. So basically, one of the things that tactful language really does is that it opens doors in negotiations. So when you use diplomatic language, it kind of leads to this receptiveness and more favorable outcomes.
Right. It's like setting the table, right? It's like instead of being confrontational, it's like being diplomatic.
Exactly.
And so you get people to be a little bit more receptive to what you have to say. And it's not just about achieving your goals. It's about, navigating those sensitive, potentially challenging discussions without causing friction.
Right. Yeah.
So the sources that we were looking at gave a good example, which was instead of saying, your proposal is unacceptable, you could say something like, let's explore how we can better align our perspectives on this.
Yes. That's really good.
Right. So that's a much better way to approach that.
Exactly. And it doesn't even stop there. Even when you're, let's say you're declining a business offer, when you're declining something, there's a way to do it tactfully so that you preserve the relationship.
Right. You want to keep that door open for the future.
Exactly.
So what are some of the consequences? We've talked about the benefits. What are some of the consequences of a lack of tact?
So the consequences of a lack of tact. Okay, so imagine, for example, sending an email. So a poorly phrased email, it could actually jeopardize an entire deal.
Yeah, it's amazing how quickly, just a slight kind of misinterpretation of tone or even just a badly worded email can really derail a project.
Oh, for sure, for sure. And another consequence is that it damages relationships. So imagine you're working in a place, and then you publicly criticize, someone senior to you. That can damage your reputation and can damage your relationships within that organization.
Absolutely. And the sources really emphasize this idea of using these really strong, almost absolute phrases. You start off a sentence by saying that's completely wrong. Just stuff that's going to put people on the defensive, right?
Yeah, it closes down the door for any type of conversation.
Right. So what are some things that our listeners can do to kind of be more tactful, to use words more tactfully?
So the first thing is to choose your words very carefully.
Okay.
So you want to consider the impact of the language you're using, before you actually say it.
Right. Pause and think.
Yeah, exactly. And then another thing is that, use diplomatic language.
Right.
So for example, instead of saying, you missed the deadline, you could say something like, let's discuss the challenges we encountered in meeting the deadline and explore how we can improve the process for the next time.
Yeah. So instead of, placing blame, right, you're talking about solutions.
Exactly.
Okay. So that's a good one.
And then another one is, avoid confrontational phrases.
Right. Be diplomatic.
Yeah.
So what are some common mistakes that, our listeners should avoid?
Okay, so some common mistakes. The first one is using blunt or harsh language. So without considering the feelings or the cultural context. So you're just being, blunt. You're not thinking about the other person.
Yeah, like you're just being insensitive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then another one is being confrontational.
Okay.
So, like you're using accusatory or, generalizing sentences,
Yeah. Not like you're being very like, you're not being specific, right?
Yes.
You're just kind of making these sweeping accusations.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And then the last one is, not considering implications before speaking or writing. So, you just say something or write something without actually thinking of the effect it might have on the other person.
Right. That's a good one.
Yeah.
So, yeah, words are important, right?
Yeah, definitely.
We've got to be careful about the words that we choose.
Absolutely.
So moving on to our next area, the importance of timing.
Yeah, so the importance of timing. So this is very, very important because, it can influence your negotiations if you're doing any negotiations. So basically, you want to, introduce a point at the right moment. Yeah. It can also demonstrate respect and understanding. Like imagine you're talking with a senior executive.
Right.
You want to allow them to finish speaking before you interject.
Right.
Yeah. You also want to consider cultural time perspectives. Yeah. So, in some cultures, there's this emphasis on punctuality, while in others, it's more flexible.
Right, right.
So you want to be mindful of that.
Yeah, so what are some of the consequences of poor timing?
Oh, so poor timing can really derail progress.
Right.
Or damage relationships. So like imagine you raise a sensitive issue at the wrong time.
Yeah.
It could create tension and resentment and, just put a damper on everything. It can also lead to misinterpretations or rejection. Like imagine you present an idea prematurely, before the right groundwork has been laid.
Right.
So your idea could be, shot down just because the time isn't right. It can also be seen as disrespectful. So like, if you're ignoring cultural time perspectives.
Right.
So, for example, if you're pushing for an immediate decision when the culture, calls for a more deliberate approach.
Okay.
So, these are all things to be mindful of.
Absolutely. So what are some things, strategies that our listeners can employ to, to be more tactful with their timing?
So the first one is to assess the situation before speaking.
Okay.
So you want to, kind of just think, what is the context? What's the mood of the conversation? What's the flow of the conversation?
Okay.
And, just kind of assess everything before you jump in. And then wait for appropriate moments to raise points or make decisions.
Right. Be patient, be strategic.
Yes, exactly. And then be mindful of cultural time perspectives.
Right.
So, when you're scheduling meetings or setting deadlines, you want to be aware of the cultural norms around time.
Yeah, and that can be a challenge, right? Because a lot of times, our listeners are probably, not Nigerian. Yep. They're from other cultures, so they're bringing in their own kind of time perspectives. So it's really important to just be extra aware.
Yeah, definitely.
So what are some common mistakes to avoid when it comes to timing?
So one common mistake is interrupting others frequently.
Right.
So, it's just rude. It shows that you're not really listening and you're not really valuing what the other person has to say. So that's a big no-no. And then, another one is raising sensitive issues inappropriately. So like, doing it in public when, it should be a private conversation, or doing it when emotions are high.
Right. Yeah.
So just be mindful of that. And then the last one is being insensitive to cultural norms regarding time. So, if the culture, dictates that things move at a slower pace, you have to respect that.
Right. All right. So moving on to the art of listening.
Okay. So the art of listening. So, this is really the key. It's all about tactful listening. And one of our sources said that tactful listening is about tuning into more than just the words.
Right.
So you're paying attention to, what's not being said.
Yeah.
The underlying messages, the concerns, the cues,
Right. You're reading between the lines.
Exactly. And when you do that, it gives you so much information.
Right.
You can make better decisions. You can build stronger relationships,
Yeah. And also just the idea of clarification, right? Like, if you're not sure, if you're unsure about something, ask questions to make sure that you understand.
Absolutely. Because when you ask questions, you're not just, clarifying. You're showing the speaker that you're listening, you're engaged, you care.
Right, right.
It's really a win-win.
Yeah, and it shows respect as well.
Absolutely.
So what are some of the consequences, if we don't listen well?
Oh, so if we don't listen well, we miss opportunities.
Oh.
We have misunderstandings, you know? It's like we're trying to solve a puzzle, you know, but we don't have all the pieces.
Right.
You know, it's just not going to work. We can also miss nonverbal cues.
Yeah.
So, you know, body language, facial expressions, tone of voice,
Right.
all of these things communicate a lot. And if
Right.
we're not paying attention, we're going to miss it. And then finally, we make assumptions.
Right.
So we assume we know what the other person means, you know, without really checking.
Right.
And that can lead to errors. It can damage relationships, you know. So it's really, really important to listen effectively.
Yeah. So how do we get better at listening?
So the first thing is to practice active listening.
Okay.
So this means, you know, giving the speaker your full attention,
Right.
making eye contact, you know,
Right.
using verbal and nonverbal cues to show that you're engaged.
Right. Nodding, saying, I see, all those little things.
Exactly. And also paying attention to nonverbal cues. So as I mentioned before, body language, facial expressions, tone of voice,
Right.
all of those things. And then seeking clarification. So, you know, asking open-ended questions, summarizing what you've heard to make sure you understand.
Right.
So these are all ways to improve your listening skills.
So what are some common mistakes to avoid?
So the first one is interrupting frequently.
Right.
So again, it's just not polite.
Yeah.
And it shows that you're not really listening. And then being distracted.
Okay.
So, you know, you're thinking about something else, you're checking your phone, you're looking around the room,
Right.
you know, you're not really focused on the speaker. And then finally, making assumptions without clarifying. So,
Yeah.
you know, you think you know what the other person means, but you don't really check.
Right.
So
No.
that's a big no-no.
Yeah. So moving on to our next area, navigating cultural nuances.
Okay, so navigating cultural nuances. So this is very important in Nigeria because Nigeria is a very diverse country.
So you want to be culturally sensitive.
Okay.
And so basically being culturally sensitive means, you know, adapting your behavior and your communication to fit the cultural context.
Right.
So for example, one of the things that our sources recommended is to research local customs.
Okay.
So before you go into a business meeting, you know, do some research on the cultural norms, you know, how people greet each other, what's considered polite, what's considered rude.
Right.
So you can avoid any kind of cultural faux pas.
Okay, so that's a good one. And I think also just being respectful of the hierarchies,
Yes. Yes.
right? Like a lot of times in business in Nigeria, there's a certain hierarchy, right? And so just being aware of that and being respectful of that is really important.
Yes, definitely. And another thing is, you know, learn some basic greetings,
Right.
you know, in the local language,
Yeah.
just to show that, you know, you're making an effort to connect with people on a cultural level. Right. So what are some of the consequences of not being sensitive to these nuances?
Oh, so if you're not sensitive, you're going to have misunderstandings.
Okay.
You know, awkward situations, you
Yeah.
can damage relationships.
Right.
So it's really like, you know, trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Right.
You know, it's just not going to work. You can also hinder trust and effectiveness.
Okay.
So, you know, if you're not respecting the hierarchies or the cultural norms, you know, it's just going to make it harder to build trust and to get things done. And then finally, you can cause offense,
Right.
which can damage your reputation
Right.
and your prospects.
Right.
So it's really, really important to be culturally sensitive.
Yeah. So what are some of the main things to remember when you're trying to be more sensitive to the cultural nuances?
So the first one is research.
Yeah.
So again, you know, do your research, learn about the local customs,
Okay.
the business etiquette,
Right.
and then respect traditional hierarchies. So, you know, be mindful of the pecking order, be respectful of elders,
Right.
and then learn basic greetings
Right.
in the local language.
Yeah.
Just to, you know, again, show that you're making an effort.
So what are some common mistakes to avoid?
So one common mistake is assuming that business practices are the same everywhere.
Right.
So, you know, you can't just assume that what works in your culture is going to work in Nigeria.
Yeah.
And then another one is disrespecting elders or those in authority.
Right.
So again, you know, be mindful of the hierarchies, be respectful. And then finally, being unwilling to adapt.
Right.
So, you know, you have to be flexible. You have to be willing to adjust your communication style and your behavior.
Right. Be adaptable.
Exactly.
Okay. So moving on to our next area, the role of patience.
Okay, so the role of patience. So this is really about understanding that, relationships take time to build.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to be patient. It's like planting a seed, you plant the seed, you nurture it, you give it time, and eventually it will grow.
Right.
So it's the same thing with business relationships. You have to be patient, you have to nurture the relationship, and eventually it will blossom.
Okay. So what are some of the benefits of being patient?
So the benefits of being patient are that you build strong relationships,
Right.
and that leads to, trust and collaboration.
Okay.
And also, when you're negotiating, if you're patient, you can come up with better outcomes.
Right.
So
Right.
it's really, really important to be patient.
So what are some of the consequences of being impatient?
So if you're impatient, you're going to rush things.
Okay.
And that can lead to poor results.
Right.
You're going to overlook important details. You're going to make rash decisions.
Right.
It's like you're trying to force a delicate process. It's just not going to work. And then, in negotiations, if you're impatient, you're going to end up with unfavorable compromises or you're going to damage relationships.
Right.
So it's really, really important to be patient.
Okay. So what are some strategies for cultivating patience?
So the first one is allow time for relationship building.
Okay.
So don't try to rush into a business deal,
Right.
get to know the people, build that trust,
Right.
and then don't rush decisions.
Okay.
So, take your time, gather all the information, consider all the options, and then practice patience in negotiations.
Mm-hmm.
So, be willing to listen, be willing to compromise.
Okay.
Don't try to push your agenda too hard.
So what are some common mistakes to avoid?
So one common mistake is pressuring for quick decisions.
Okay.
So, you're putting pressure on the other person to make a decision before they're ready.
Right.
And that's just not fair. And then being impatient during negotiations.
Okay.
So, you're not really listening, you're just trying to get your way.
Right.
And then finally, neglecting relationship building.
Okay.
So, you're just focused on the transaction. You're not really interested in building a long-term relationship.
Right. So it's really important to be patient and to cultivate those relationships.
Absolutely.
Okay. So moving on to our final area, developing emotional intelligence.
Okay. So developing emotional intelligence. So this is really about being aware of your emotions and the emotions of others,
Mm-hmm.
and being able to manage those emotions effectively.
Right.
So, it's like having a radar, for emotions.
Yeah.
You can sense how people are feeling. You can respond appropriately.
Right.
So, for example, one of the key components of emotional intelligence is empathy,
Okay.
which is the ability to understand and share the feelings of others.
Mm.
So you can put yourself in their shoes. You can see things from their perspective.
Yeah.
Right. And that allows you to respond in a more sensitive and appropriate way.
Right. So what are some of the consequences of lacking emotional intelligence?
So if you lack emotional intelligence, you're going to misunderstand people.
Okay.
You're going to offend people.
Right.
You're going to damage relationships.
Right.
So it's really like, navigating a social situation without a map.
Right.
You're just going to get lost. You can also appear insensitive.
Right.
Or uncaring.
Right.
So, if you're not aware of how your words and actions are affecting others, you can come across as really cold and uncaring.
Right.
And then finally, you can behave tactlessly.
Right.
If you're not able to control your emotions,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to say and do things that you regret.
Right.
So it's really, really important to develop your emotional intelligence.
Okay. So how do we do that?
Right.
How do we develop our emotional intelligence?
So the first thing is to work on self-awareness. So understand your own emotions, understand how they affect your behavior,
Right.
and then practice empathy.
Hmm.
So try to see things from other people's perspective, try to understand their feelings,
Right.
and then finally manage your emotions.
Okay.
So develop strategies for dealing with stress, for dealing with anger, for dealing with all those difficult emotions.
Right. So what are some common mistakes to avoid?
So one common mistake is being unaware of your emotional responses.
Okay.
So you're not really paying attention to how you're feeling. You're not really aware of how your emotions are affecting your behavior.
Right.
And then Another one is dismissing the emotions of others.
Right.
So, you're invalidating their feelings, you're telling them that their emotions are not important,
Right.
and then finally reacting impulsively.
Right.
So you're not taking the time to think things through, you're just reacting in the moment.
Right. Right.
So these are all things to avoid.
Yeah. So as we bring this deep dive to a close, I think it's clear that tact in Nigerian business, it's really a multifaceted thing. Right?
Yeah, definitely. It's not just one thing.
It's all these things that we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
It's the words that we choose, it's the timing, it's the listening, it's the cultural sensitivity, it's the patience, it's the emotional intelligence.
Exactly. And all these things, come together to make you a really effective communicator.
Right.
And someone who can, build strong relationships and achieve their goals in the Nigerian business environment.
Yeah, and so I think the key takeaway here is just to be mindful, right?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Be mindful, be aware.
To be aware, to be conscious of how you're communicating and how you're coming across, and to be, to really try to put yourself in the shoes of the other person.
Yeah.
And, to be patient, to be respectful.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think if you do those things, you'll find that you're much more successful in your dealings in Nigeria.
Definitely.
So I think that pretty much wraps it up.
Yeah.
I hope this deep dive has been helpful for you guys.
Yeah.
And, we encourage you to go back and listen to it again, maybe take some notes.
Yeah.
And really think about how you can apply these principles in your own lives.
Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, it's all about building those strong relationships.
Right.
And, achieving your goals in a way that is both effective and respectful.
Yeah. All right, so that's it for today's episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time.
See you next time.
All right, welcome everyone to The Deep Dive. Today we're going to be diving into something that's really, really critical for anyone who's looking to do business in Nigeria, and that is the art of tact.
Yeah, it's something that we've been really focusing on the show recently, and, just really looking at what it takes to actually have things work in Nigeria. And one of the elements that consistently comes up again and again is tact.
Yeah, and to really unpack this, we're going to explore 6 interconnected areas. We're going to be talking about the power of words.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about the importance of timing, the art of listening, navigating